Kim Young-ja walked into the factory carrying bags of rice balls she made at home. She entered the dormitory area and gave the signal that she had arrived. She waited in the empty room looking up at the ceiling tiles. Some of them were damaged, which wasn't the case the previous day. When nobody came, she pushed up the ceiling tile and looked in. Her heart dropped with the rice balls onto the ground. She saw a man dead hanging from the building's rafters. She searched around for the others and found them, in 2 piles next to the hanging man. 31 people dead. She swallowed her tears and made the phone call. Welcome to Korean True Crime with me, your host, Mimi Mizuko. Thank you to Vix Mack, Lala, William White, Jiwon Edwards, Nico, Elijah Hancock, Anamanam, Dr. Bob, Maya96, Lumos, Emma Brown, David Tahoya, Adriana, Dade512, Lisa, and Shebecca for your support on Patreon. Thank you for voting on today's episode topic. Patrons vote on future episode topics and hear the episodes first with ad-free early access. We now have a sticker bonus tier and a hoodie bonus tier. Currently, the Korean True Crime logo sticker is available, but will be put in the vault as new stickers become available. Become a patron for 3 months and earn a reward. Thank you to my amazing patrons for making this show possible. Warning: today's episode has some graphic descriptions of suicide. Listener discretion is advised. On August 29, 1987, 32 bodies were found in the ceiling crawl space of the Yongin factory location belonging to the company 5 Oceans Trading Company. The police who arrived on the scene quickly began to photograph and record footage of the extremely bizarre crime scene. Some of the ceiling tiles were broken, revealing that someone was lying across the ceiling beams. When the tiles were pried off, they found the gruesome scene. On large sheets of plywood, laid 31 bodies in 2 piles. 19 dead bodies were piled in one area, and 12 were on top of each other in a second. In the corner was a man, hanging from a noose, wearing nothing but his underwear. All of the deceased were wearing nothing but pajamas and underwear. As they began to inspect the deceased, they saw that each of the dead on the ground were bound by their hands and feet with loose cloths and ties. They were also gagged with tissues in their noses and mouths. The police recognized the woman that they had been searching for, Park Seung-ja. That's a name you'll hear often in today's case. Park Seung-ja, 48 years old at the time of her death, was the owner of 5 Oceans Trading Company, which owned the factory they were discovered in. In the days leading up to their discovery, the company had come under fire for their financial decisions and potential frauds. This led the police to believe that they had stumbled upon the mass suicide of Park Seung-ja and her company's executives, but Park Seung-ja also went by another name that complicated this case even further. Some knew her as God's left hand. 3 years prior, on May 31st, 1984, Odeyang Trading Company was opened by Park Seung-ja. Odeyang means 5 oceans, so we will refer to this company as 5 Oceans. Park Seung-ja was a pastor for a Protestant denomination that she led. She had a history in being a part of the Protestant faith and eventually branched out to open her own church. But it's very expensive to lead your own religion, and surviving off of donations and tithing alone wasn't enough. She decided that opening a company would allow her to be profitable and have enough money to do the charitable acts she was motivated by. To start her business, she asked some of her loyal congregants for loans that she would pay back with incredible interest rates. Interest rates as high as 40%. As she received some loans, she took out her own loans to pay back the interest so that the creditors would have their ease of mind and trust that she would return their investments. Park Seung-ja was trusted by her community. People saw her as a kind-hearted philanthropist. She wanted to earn money not for personal gain, but so that she could help those who were poverty-stricken or underprivileged. With her business, she offered jobs to people who couldn't find livable wages and were struggling to afford their housing and food. As the business started, they manufactured all sorts of home good products. The business was immediately becoming a success. Her husband, Lee Ki-jung, the director of the construction bureau in Cheongcheongnam-do, was immensely helpful to the success of the launch of her business. He was well loved in his community and had many connections that helped with asking for initial investments. Although he helped to spread the word about her business, he wasn't very involved in the actual business and rarely visited because he was maintaining his own job. Under Pak Sun-ja's leadership, employees said that they loved their job and they were offered food, housing, and childcare while they were working. They were given amenities and benefits that no other company was offering for entry-level factory workers. There were private residences and dormitories, a cafeteria, and a childcare center that acted as a school for children up to 18. Although for children in South Korea, elementary to high school are offered a free education, but Pak Sun-ja guaranteed that they would receive an education that pleased the Judeo-Christian God, according to her church's teachings. At the factory, there was also an elderly nursing home for the parents of the workers. The employees could work, live, and have free childcare and education for their children, and free housing and healthcare for their aging parents. There were, and are, no companies offering entry-level jobs with these kind of benefits in Korea to this day. This was too good to be true. And maybe it was. More talk about the Five Oceans Trading Company began to circulate. People heard about the financial opportunity for investment in a rising company that sought to do good for the community. It was very appealing to many people to hear that they could be a part of such a philanthropic company. People of all walks of life began to come to the main office of Five Oceans to hear about their loan and job program. Some people came just to hear about joining Pak Sun-ja's congregation. Five Oceans was never officially a church on paper, but instead was a company whose owner offered religious services on the company's grounds. Now that the company was thriving a bit more, about 6 months after opening, Pak Sun-ja lowered the interest rate for new creditors down to 20%, which is still a very high interest rate for a private loan with minimal risk, or so people thought. The people who were loaning money to Pak Sun-ja and the company were receiving their interest back, but were told to wait a few years for a full repayment on their loan. The paid interest was proof enough for them that she was trustworthy. People were so confident in Pak Sun-ja's business and leadership that they began to take out their own private loans just to help give more money to the business and church. They thought that with more money, they would do more good, and they would also get a 20% increase in their money when their investment was returned. Pak Sun-ja would preach to the followers that to obey their God, you need to be giving and free from attachment to your possessions, like money. So people began to give loans, upwards of 90 million won. That would be close to 4 billion won in 2024, or about 2.9 million US dollars. These creditors were not all wealthy people. The majority of them were not. Some of them were even taking out insurmountable loans just to give money to Pak Sun-ja. When these people could no longer afford their own housing or food, that's when she'd offer them jobs at the factory. While acting as a charitable woman, she was catching her creditors in a web. They had become dependent on her. Not only were they financially tied to her, but when they lived under her roof at Five Oceans, they also needed to follow her rules. She acted as a totalitarian ruler, completely opposite to the loving mother appearance that she was showing to the world. Once her employees had no options to easily leave, the entire experience changed. While many followers have not talked about any negative experiences they had, those that agreed to speak to journalists and reporters told of prison-like living conditions. Employees who had come to live in the dormitories as a family were forced to separate. No married couples were allowed to cohabitate. Workers were assigned living quarters and parents were separated from their own children, even if the children were babies or toddlers. Children were made to live away from the families, but they were told that this was for their best interest. Pak Sun-ja convinced her employees that their lives would be so much more peaceful without the burden of raising their children and managing a household. They could devote themselves to working and devote themselves to God. According to Dr. Stephen Hassan, a mental health professional and expert in cults, no one voluntarily joins a cult. They are recruited into a web of lies. Without informed consent, vulnerable people are targeted and told half-truths about the organization or group that entices them in. The vulnerable community that Pak Sun-ja targeted was the poor Christian community that was desperate for hope out of their financial struggles and unstable employment. She offered solutions to all of their problems, offered them a life of morality, and offered them an opportunity to feel proud of themselves. To her creditors, she offered money to the greedy. That was all they needed, although not many of her major creditors ended up joining the congregation. Cults are not always tied to religion. Cults can be political, center around self-help, exist in a single family, or a multi-level marketing group. Cults come in various sizes and serve different purposes, but they typically use deception to exert undue influence to make people reliant and dependent on them. The influence can come from a relationship, like family, friendship, or community. This community can even exist online, as from an influencer or a celebrity. Your religion can influence you, or your boss can influence you. In this instance, Pak Sin-ja was both the president of the company and was their religious leader. In my last episode, we also discussed the introduction of religion into Korea and why it has had such endurance. The strong cultural practice of respecting your elders and those above you in power allowed Pak Sin-ja to exert control over everyone around her. She put herself at the top of all of her congregants and employees' lives. Dr. Hassan teaches that undue influence is deception and manipulation to make a person change. This includes the lack of ability to question authority and convincing someone to not listen to their intuition or gut. To begin this process, the cult leaders may isolate you from outside influences, make you feel fearful, coerce you into following orders, and may even enslave people who try to leave. Cults don't want to completely change a person's identity, but instead, create a new normal for the person that follows their guidelines. For Pak Sin-ja, she isolated her workers from the outside world by having them live within the factories. People very rarely left the buildings, and when they did, they were chaperoned or questioned for their motives for leaving. To many, it felt like an interrogation that was so overwhelming that people stopped trying to leave. About once or twice a month, the church would take vans to go to a group outing or small group outings. But as soon as you returned, they had to report everything you did while you were out. Her followers were required to attend church services in which she preached about their greediness and sins. Her religion could be considered apocalypticism, but the focus of her religious teachings were not about the world ending, but that their God might someday create an apocalypse or rapture to end the sins of man once more.
Hey, it's Kaylee Cuoco for Priceline. Ready to go to your happy place for a happy price? Well, why didn't you say so? Just download the Priceline app right now and save up to 60% on hotels. So whether it's Cousin Kevin's Kazoo Concert in Kansas City, go Kevin, or Becky's Bachelorette Bash in Bermuda, you never have to miss a trip ever again. So download the Priceline app today. Your savings are waiting.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
This is a common belief amongst many Western religions and the subject to many films and books. Pak Sin-ja named the church and business Five Oceans because of a quote she often said, "I am the one who will rule the five oceans, and from now on, I will rule the entire world." With the end of the world potentially within their lifetimes, Pak Sin-ja placed herself at their helm. She wasn't just their pastor, she sought to become their god. Her teachings began to include more detailed messages from God. She said that God spoke to her directly to communicate messages to her followers. As the Christian faith includes the belief that God can speak to people, her followers accepted this. But then the messages began to be personal and placed blame on her followers for not giving enough money to the church or for not working hard enough to get others to bring money in. Personal sins were brought up in church as a way to shame and embarrass her congregants. As a way to control someone, she offered punishments if they sinned. She also determined what was a sin, and this could be changed on a whim. The biggest shock to anyone who moved into the dormitories found was that there was repentance times allocated. Pak Sin-ja called this their time of reflection. Just as they had to attend church at certain times, they also were forced to attend these time of reflection meetings. In these meetings, people were forced to reveal anything they could have done that would be considered a sin to Pak Sin-ja. They detailed how they lived for the past month and their comings and goings. If someone didn't have anything to reveal, she would consider them lying. This wasn't just a humiliation tactic. After people revealed their sins, The others in the group would begin to beat them mercilessly. Everyone got this treatment, and oftentimes, Park Sin-ja would choose who would beat the person so that it hurt them the most. She didn't choose the strongest person, but who would have the biggest emotional impact. Children were asked to beat their siblings or parents. Wives and husbands were made to beat each other. It created resentment between people and fear of Park Sin-ja. It made people obedient. Everyone took turns hitting and kicking their family members, friends, and coworkers until it became normal. They were holding each other accountable for their sins, and they were grateful to Park Sin-ja for the forgiveness as well, because she would absolve them of their sins during these meetings. She told them that God had granted her the power to absolve her followers of sins if they followed her obediently. And these beatings weren't just merely roughing a person up. Many of these beatings led to a person losing consciousness. Park Sin-ja told her followers that if they died during these beatings, that it was because God had chosen them to die graciously and go to heaven. Everything she did and told them, she attributed to God having spoken directly to her and having told her that this was the way it had to be done. She had total authority over their lives at this point. But to them, this was still better than working for a few dollars a day selling scrap or cardboard. To some of her employees who had good jobs before they arrived, they couldn't leave now. They were so far in debt, they couldn't feed themselves or house themselves anymore. They were entirely dependent on her. But times weren't always filled with fear for her followers and employees. They also felt a great sense of community living together. Many people also wholeheartedly believed in what she was brainwashing them with. They did believe that she was the left hand of God and could interpret God's messages. This was until some people began to see behind the curtain. When watching television, an employee at Five Oceans saw a broadcast about the company. In particular, this one talked about the charitable things they had at the business, the nursery and the children's academy. This is where the company had their childcare facility, and they would raise the employees' children while they focused on work. The children's academy was said to be nice, but for the most part, the children were only learning about why Park Sin-ja was the greatest leader and religious songs about Five Oceans. This employee, Jo Chang-ja, and her husband had come to the company after seeing it as an investment opportunity. Her husband had lost his job and was offered work at Five Oceans, while Jo Chang-ja was interested in investing money because of the interest rates. Together, they moved into the dormitories, but were separated into different places, and their own children were placed with a different family. While their children were nearby, they were asked not to visit their children and to not address their children. Park Sin-ja had convinced dozens of parents to hand over their children to her and to be raised by others who worked for the company. Jo Chang-ja and her husband were told they were not allowed to speak to each other or to their children. Any family members conversing was strictly prohibited. This was considered a sin. A husband and a wife couldn't even live in the same housing area. They were separated into different rooms. Sometimes they were made to live with different families to strictly adhere to celibacy. Any sexual contact was prohibited and was deemed sinful enough for a time of reflection. One of the families living at Five Ocean moved in with 7 of their family members, kids, aunts, uncles, grandparents, but were instructed that they had to hide the fact that they were family and were not allowed to talk to one another or live with each other. Park Sin-ja brainwashed the children by telling them, "You don't have any parents. You're orphans and I'm your real mother now." To avoid children who clearly were old enough to know who their parents were, she told the children that if they ever found their parents or spoke to them again, they would suffer in hell for all of eternity. These children were then terrified of meeting strangers who could be their parents or seeing their parents around the factory. The worst situation of all was that these children weren't sleeping in separate areas. They slept in the dormitories with families, and occasionally they were made to sleep in the same home as their real parents, just to test them. They were forced to see their mother and father, but could never show any affection or familiarity with them. And people were encouraged to report one another for acting too close. And they did, because they wanted to go to heaven so badly, and also to avoid being beaten during the time of reflection. Park Sin-ja wanted to be the only family any of these people had. By removing their ideas about familial loyalty and bonds, she wanted them to see her as their collective mother and God. There are so many followers and former employees who have not come forward about their experiences, so we can't know every person's experience at the factories. But those who have come forward have said that each person had a very different experience and set of rules. When parents visited the daycare and school, the children were not told about their parents. Older children were instructed to address their parents as 과장, a title that means manager or chief for men. Mothers were referred to by their job title, such as gardening lady or factory worker. Some children were told that their parents had died or abandoned them, so they truly didn't even know if their parents came by to steal a moment together. When families came in, children who were old enough to clearly understand what was going on were forced to beat their parents while shouting the 10 Commandments repeatedly until Park Sun-ja felt that she had control over the child and the parents. After a while, the children were extremely obedient and would do anything she said without hesitation. In the broadcast Jo Chang-ja saw, Park Sun-ja was on the ground, helping their children put on hanbok, traditional Korean clothes for a holiday celebration. She was helping teach them, feed them, raise them. But what was the most suspicious was Park Sun-ja was advertising the childcare facilities as an orphanage. These children were not up for adoption, but she was marketing her childcare services as a charitable orphanage in which she raised these children from the goodness of her heart. Her followers hadn't thought about what the childcare situation looked like to outsiders. It looked like they gave up their children and truly abandoned them to the church. Park Sun-ja was raising their children to be future employees and worshippers. The elderly nursing facility they had was also being advertised as a nursing home for abandoned or unhoused elderly people. These elderly were the parents of the employees. They weren't alone. Park Sun-ja was lying to everyone about the reality of the situation. But when you're made to beat your grandmother or parents, siblings, coworkers for even being friendly to you, what could possibly shock any of them? In April of 1986, Park Sun-ja used 700 million won, a large portion of the money loaned to her, to invest in manufacturing electronics. Her business at this point was just making the household goods and toys. They had never ventured into any electronics manufacturing, but she found a company in Japan that would help her to begin making electronic components. But the company in Japan, when time came to begin, completely ghosted her. The company in Japan was a scam, and they lost all of that money. The police believe that the business venture was a common fraud tactic used by the Korean and Japanese Yakuza, and they never found that money. It could be possible that Park Sun-ja had taken the money or hidden it away from her followers as well. Immediately after this, she didn't seem worried about the loss of the huge amount of money. Instead, she turned to her followers and told them that they needed to go out and get her more believers to borrow money from. She told them to visit old coworkers, friends, extended family, anyone they could that they hadn't talked to yet, and tell them to come loan the business money. She had even less money to pay back interest now, but her followers came through for her and got about 8.9 billion won, covering what she lost more than tenfold. The Netflix series In the Name of God, A Holy Betrayal, Episode 4, is an interview source for this episode regarding the reinvestigation of the case. In this episode, reporter Seo Young-suk was interviewed regarding a mini documentary he had made about Five Oceans in June of 1986. At this time, the business was successful, and Park Sun-ja had just received a presidential award as a medium-sized company helping their community. Because of this, Seo Young-suk wanted to feature them in a short documentary that would air on his news channel. When he first visited Five Oceans, he did a tour of the working areas to get an idea of what the daily experiences as an employee at their company felt like. His footage shows that the employees were clearly asked to put on a show for the cameras. As the footage shows Seo Young-suk walking through the storage rooms and factory lines, you can see that Five Oceans was manufacturing and selling traditional furniture, children's toys, and a whole arrangement of household goods like decorative art and jewelry boxes. Everything seemed legitimate at their business, but they had a lot of goods storage. They had more goods stored than they had being made. Although, despite the documentary being filmed over the course of a full day, they never got any footage of the employees actually working in the facilities to make products. Perhaps they took day shifts to make and then ship the products, and this wasn't a production day. It just seemed odd that they would waste this time like this when time is money. The business was successful though, so clearly they were doing something right. Park Sun-ja's business skills and leadership had led Five Oceans to receive awards and recognition for their philanthropic work. Cha Young-suk wanted to highlight this charitable nature of the business. So, as the documentary progressed, he was able to meet Park Sun-ja herself and interview her. He asked her questions relating to the startup of her company and congratulated her on the success. She wasn't flattered by the compliment. Instead, she clarified that a businesswoman was not what she was. She stated that she did not start a business to become wealthy or powerful. She was not a woman who wanted fancy things or jewelry. She was not interested in investing her money in stocks or making a lot of money for herself. She said that she only wanted to be known as a person who led a selfless life. She wanted to be known for helping the underprivileged. What a powerful quote. Because to everyone on the outside, that is what she was. She invented her image. She was almost a Mother Teresa character. Park Sun-ja took the documentary crew to the childcare center that she continued to refer to as the orphanage. They received a very specific religious education at this academy. Women without children worked at the center teaching them. The documentary crew was able to see a few kids as young as 2 and 3, and some as old as 16 or 17. When they spoke to the younger kids, a boy sang a song for them that he had learned. The song was a religious hymn about how great Five Oceans was. When the interviewer asked the boy what did that song mean, he didn't seem to know or understand the words. Although most children don't understand the songs that they sang, it seems that the children were being taught things they couldn't yet grasp. It was likely nobody with a background in childhood development was actually working at the facility. When speaking to a teenage boy, he turned away from the camera, not wanting to be on film, or being told not to show his face. See, extended family or former classmates might recognize him. And this might bring unwanted attention to the orphanage situation because viewers would realize that these kids are not orphans, but actually the employees' children. And then people would start asking questions about the business. The boy answered questions very simply and was attentive to mention his praise of Park Sun-ja and Five Oceans. But his answers sounded disingenuous. He ended his interview by thanking Park Sun-ja for the luxuries that they were given. She had really convinced and brainwashed these children into believing that their lives were better here. We can only wonder if these children were also subject to social isolation just as the parents were, or that if the young children were also made to attend repentance meetings. For a little over a year, there wasn't much else said about Five Oceans. The business continued to grow, and they had more and more employees. They opened a few more factories in different locations around Daejeon, but their products remained about the same, just offering new designs or toys. Park Sun-ja continued to take in people who were thankful for having regular meals, clean clothes, a place to live, and stable jobs. And her employees became more and more isolated to the outside world. Some had never left the facilities after their first day of work. Her business cult seemed like it would continue forever without any issues. Five Oceans was bringing in money, but the creditors had not seen a large return on their loans. Park Sun-ja paid on the interest, but she didn't return their loans. Some creditors noticed that their payments were late or never came in. People started to get upset, but were told to just wait because Park Sun-ja would always pay her debts. Because she had been so trustworthy up to this point, they really had no reason not to believe her, especially those who had no clue what was going on behind the closed doors at Five Oceans. But downfall was coming for Park Sun-ja, and his name was Lee Sang-bae. Lee Sang-bae was the father of 5 children who had all borrowed money over time from him and his wife. When one of his children needed money for various things, they would ask their parents for help, who generously gave. Over the course of a year, the children had borrowed approximately 500 million won, which would be 1.8 billion won today, or about 1.3 million US dollars. Lee Sang-bae knew that some of the money was going into an investment opportunity, but when the repayments stopped coming in, he started to ask his children further questions. At this point, all of his children were working at Five Oceans. They were not willing to talk about the business, or that they knew that there was fraud happening. His children were deeply devoted to Park Sun-ja at this point and were thoroughly brainwashed. So Lee Sang-bae decided to go to the business with his wife and demand his money back immediately. He arrived at Five Oceans and demanded to see Park Sun-ja. He said he wanted the loans to be repaid in full that day. He wasn't going to wait any longer, or he would get the police involved. A few managing employees led Lee Sang-bae to a large worship room near Park Sun-ja's office. She led worships and services in this room, but also time for reflection meetings. Park Sun-ja ordered 5 men to begin to beat Lee Sang-bae until he was barely conscious. All while, his children were made to watch him be beaten next to his wife. When he was begging for mercy, they stopped, and Park Sun-ja offered him a solution. She told him that he could fingerprint and sign a document that stated he relinquished his rights to collect on the loans and that Park Sun-ja was not required to pay them back. Reluctantly, he signed, fearing that if he didn't, he would have died. But Lee Sang-bae loved his children. He loved them more than the money. He knew after leaving the factory bruised and bloody that he needed to get his children out of there. He drove away from the factory and didn't look back as he went straight to the police department. He told the detectives everything. He showed them the promissory notes and his wounds, and he was able to give accurate descriptions of the 5 men and Park Sun-ja. When the police arrived to the factory, the 5 men went willingly, but they didn't have anything to arrest or take in Park Sun-ja since she did not physically harm Lee Sang-bae, and there wasn't enough to go off of for a fraud investigation. So that day, the only thing they could do was take in the 5 men to the police station for assault. These men were not worried about being arrested or getting in trouble for assaulting Lee Sang-bae, but they should have been. The men sat calmly at the police station despite being faced with the charges. Lee Sang-bae spoke to reporters about his situation, and the news station deemed it interesting enough to report about it on the news the next morning. When the segment was broadcasted, numerous creditors of Park Sun-ja contacted the police, expressing that they also wanted to file complaints and pursue legal action against her for repayment. Subsequently, the police opened an investigation into both Five Oceans and Park Sun-ja on suspicions of fraud. Park Sun-ja's loan system was difficult to understand, and with the secrecy of her employees and followers, nobody was going to snitch on her or give the police a reason to get a warrant. But after interviewing more creditors about their loans and their past experiences with the church, some of whom had also been beaten, the police had enough to take Park Sun-ja in to be interrogated. 9 days after Lee Sang-bae was beaten, the police brought in Park Sun-ja to ask her about the assaults and the loans. When speaking, she was very gentle and had a nun-like aura. She seemed like someone who couldn't hurt a fly, and it seemed like she truly believed herself to be the embodiment of holiness. But then, a reporter came in with the filming crew and began to ask her questions. The second she saw the cameras, Park Sun-ja began to panic and fainted onto the couch. One of the men who had participated in the assault, her eldest son, picked her up onto his back like a child and began rushing out of the room. The police weren't done interviewing her, but he started yelling that it was a medical emergency and he was going to take her to the hospital down the street. The nurses took Park Sun-ja to a bed to wait for a doctor to examine her, but by the time the police had arrived, Park Sun-ja and her son had quietly slipped out of the room and escaped through the stairwell. When she arrived back to the factory, she ordered 80 of her closest believers and family to gather together at the Yongin factory, which was situated in a little bit more rural location. Employees who witnessed this event said that everyone was getting into the van with smiles on their faces and without any kind of rush. They seemed almost carefree. Most people believed that these people were going on an outing together. Park Sun-ja had told her followers that the police have no power over them because they were blessed by God. An extremely dangerous belief to have. By the time the police arrived with a warrant the following day, their vans had already left the main branch and they were nowhere to be found. They had obtained a warrant for her arrest because they had discovered the extent of fraud that Five Oceans was committing. The warrant allowed for the search and seizure of 8 financial institutions related to the business and her properties. They had discovered that 10 billion won had gone missing overnight. Today, 10 billion won would be 36 billion won, according to inflation calculators. This is about 26 million US dollars. None of her employees had any idea what was happening. They were not told why so many people had just suddenly left. They watched as the police arrived and searched the factory and dormitories. The police walked through the factory searching everywhere they could for any information. That's when they noticed something was extremely off about the manufacturing rooms. They weren't real. The manufacturing lines were not functional. There were some assembly lines, but the products in these rooms were being taken apart and staged to be put together again to appear as if they were making products. They found paperwork that these items had been purchased wholesale from China, imported, and then resold as if they had manufactured them. 5 Oceans was a Ponzi scheme and a drop shipping front. In fact, they had very few sales for how much money they had. Almost all of the income that the business had was from private loans. If you aren't familiar with a Ponzi scheme, it's investment fraud. A company that is organizing a Ponzi scheme collects investments for their business with the promise of little to no risk for the investors because they offer high interest rates that are paid on time. Their money never goes into the business or gets invested. Instead, the schemer uses the new loans to pay interest on the existing creditor's interest. They're always taking out new loans to pay the interest from the previous loans. There is never any intention to pay off anyone's loans because without the loans, they would have no income. They couldn't possibly pay off the money in the end. Park Sin-ja's system began to collapse as too many creditors got wise and asked to cash out. Lee Sang-bae brought the end of her Ponzi scheme by involving the police. It was surprising that she had not been reported to the police up until this point. Now on the run, with insurmountable debt, she and her 80 followers arrived at the Yongin factory. The factory was mainly dormitories, but this was also where the orphanage and nursing homes were. It was mostly residential as a front to pretend to be a functioning factory. Park Sin-ja was concerned that the police would arrive and see the children in the orphanage abandoned and take them in and realize that the orphanage was also a fraud. She was still thinking that she could get out of this. So the children were also put in vans and sent to a farm not that far away from the factory in Yongin. However, immediately an anonymous caller, most likely one of the parents, called in to tip the police stating that the children were taken to that farm. The information was something only one of the followers would have known. The children were brought into the station and slowly reunited with the parents as they were found, but the police needed to find Park Sin-ja fast. As they reached the Yongin factory, Park Sin-ja chose 31 of her family and followers to join her in her secret hiding location. Within the ceiling crawl space above the kitchen area of the dormitories was a loose ceiling tile that they peeled back and slid onto some plywood boards. The plywood kept them from falling through the thin ceiling tiles. But not all of her followers were chosen. The other 49 followers went to an empty room in the back of the factory. Whilst in the ceiling, Park Sin-ja told everyone that they needed to remain silent. Many of her followers had no idea that they had even gone into the ceiling the night of the 25th. It was clear that this space had been intended for a hideout because the boards had been placed and there was dry food and water. There was ramen and jarred food as well as canned food. There were shelter supplies like toilet paper and a jug that could be used as a urinal. There was enough supplies for them to survive in the ceiling for at least a few weeks, although they would not be comfortable. Surviving in the ceiling would be grueling for them over the next few days because the temperature in the daytime was reaching 30 to 35 Celsius or 85 to 95 Fahrenheit in the daytime. And they were in a non-air-conditioned metal-roofed room with no airflow or fans. The temperatures that room would have reached would make anyone experience a heat stroke. According to the investigators, it would have reached a daytime temperature of 71 degrees Celsius or 159 degrees Fahrenheit. Typically, the human body can only withstand 35 degrees Celsius with high humidity before dying. There's no possibility they would have survived in that heat for even a short burst of time. But they were in that ceiling for 3 days. Regardless, Park Sin-ja's trusted employee Kim Young-ja came to the factory each day to deliver those homemade rice balls that she had made for the people in hiding. She would stand on a table and hold up the bags to deliver them to the 32 people hiding, but she never spoke to them and left quickly afterwards. She was merely told to keep them supplied with food. She visited once a day to deliver the rice balls. However, on August 29th, 1987, when she visited to deliver the rice balls in the morning, she knocked on the ceiling tile and waited for the tile to open for her to pass up the food. But that day, there was no sound, and nobody came to retrieve the food. She stood on the table and lifted up the ceiling tile and looked inside. The 32 people were dead. Kim Young-ja immediately called Park Sin-ja's husband, Lee Ki-jung, and told him the news. His wife and children were dead. Lee Gi-jung drove to the factory to see for himself, and once he confirmed, he called the police at 4 p.m. that day. The police arrived and all of the hiding people were made to leave. They huddled around outside, unknowing about the death of their leader. The police worked quickly to photograph and record footage of all the evidence at the scene. Inside the ceiling crawl space was gruesome. There were 32 people, including Park Sun-ja, dead. One of the men was hanging from a noose in the corner, while the 31 people laid in 2 piles on top of one another. There were 28 women and 4 men. In one pile, 19 people were stacked on top of each other. In the other pile were 12 people, including Park Sun-ja and her 3 children. Lee Gi-jung had found his entire family dead in that ceiling space. He refused to speak to reporters about his involvement or feelings on the matter. He was in a complete state of shock, though. He told the police he had no idea that his family or anyone else had any intentions of dying. Although he didn't explicitly state it, it was clear that he had known they were hiding there, but his sorrow seemed genuine, whether or not he knew that they would die. In the crawl space, the 31 people who were dead on the boards were bound with ties and cloth by their hands and feet. The ties were loosely done in knots. Their necks had rope marks, and their mouths and noses had tissues lodged inside them to gag them. The hanging man was still hanging from the noose in his underwear, the rope digging into his neck. The top of his feet dragged on the floor, and his knees bent slightly. The police were baffled by the scene and couldn't understand how this could have happened. The police began to quickly move the bodies to send them to the morgue to be autopsied. It took 8 officers to move each body from the ceiling to the ground. Just lowering the body down took 4 people in the ceiling and 4 people below. As they brought the bodies down and out of the factory, 5 Oceans congregants wept outside hysterically. They could not believe their pastor, their Messiah, their left hand of God had died. Although it was not investigated or followed, I wonder how many of her followers took their own lives just to follow her into the afterlife. Did any of them return to a normal life? Could they return to a normal life? By the time the chief of forensics, Dr. Seo Jae-kwon, arrived at the scene, all of the bodies had been moved, which he did not approve of. By moving the bodies, they may have lost crucial evidence that he could have collected. The bodies had been fingerprinted on the scene by officers and photographed. Dr. Seo said that it already felt like the police were trying to rush the case, even before they had left the crime scene. He knew something was off about this. They dusted the area for fingerprints to figure out how 32 people could have gotten into the ceiling. There were fingerprints and footprints all along the wall where they leveraged themselves on top of a chair, table, or another person and pushed up into the ceiling. They were most likely hoisted up by another person. The chief of police held a press conference a few days later stating that this was a mass suicide by a religious cult, that Park Sun-ja had participated in a large-scale Ponzi scheme and was overwhelmed by debt and ultimately decided to end her own life and took some of her religious followers with her. The police concluded that they deduced how the 32 people had died. Park Sun-ja was the first to die according to her time of death. Lee Kyung-soo was the last to die, who was the factory manager hanging by his neck. The cult had agreed that they weren't going to escape the situation they were in and couldn't avoid it any longer. Park Sun-ja told Lee Kyung-soo to tie each of them up so that they couldn't resist and to tie a rope around their necks one at a time and strangle them to death. Then he must kill himself by hanging. At first, the police wondered if the tissues in their mouths and noses had contained some form of chloroform or poison that would have made this task easier and quieter. But when the results came back, there were no drugs or alcohol in anyone's system. So one by one, Lee Kyung-soo had started with Park Sun-ja and then killed the others. However, many of the experts on this case, including Dr. Seo, the chief of forensics, disagreed with this conclusion. He felt like they were trying to close the case as quickly as possible and that considering murder or foul play would just complicate the case and prolong it. The first time you hear this, it makes sense though. It seems like the most rational way this could have happened. There isn't a way they could have tied themselves up, but there were pieces of evidence being completely ignored. But there wasn't anything Dr. Seo could do to reopen the case. So that was the conclusion that was given, and the case was considered solved. There's still quite a bit of time left in this episode, so I know you know that this isn't the end. This case would weigh heavily on Kim Hyun, a former detective who, as a part of a special investigation committee, petitioned to have the National Assembly reopen the case as a mass murder rather than a mass suicide. With the support of the chief of forensics, the case was reopened in 1988. Although the original detective on the case refuted their beliefs and thought they were unsupported and irrational. First, let's address the evidence that was at the scene of the crime before we get into any theories of how these people died so that we can make informed opinions. In the attic, there was ample food and water. They had been using a urine jug as a bathroom and had been eating the rice balls that the loyal follower had brought to them. But when the police found their bodies, the food was barely touched, and many of the rice balls were moldy. This most likely occurred because they had died the day prior, and in the heat, the food became moldy. But why was so little of the food and water eaten? It was much less than 32 people would have needed to eat. Chairman of the committee, Kim Hyun, proposed that they had been rationing their food. They were trying to survive for as long as possible. So why would they eventually kill themselves when the police didn't even know where they were? The people working in the factory didn't even know they were up there. They had someone to bring them food and water each day, ensuring their survival. Except for the heat, they could have stayed in there for a long while. On the floor of the crawl space, there were multiple notes that had been ripped up and scattered across the floor. The notes matched the handwriting of a few of the deceased, including Park Sun-ja. The notes had messages written on them like, "The boss went to get poison and water," or "Samu is suffering too." And after reconstructing a ripped up note, it read, "The development expenses will increase. Keep quiet. Keep your mouth shut. They betrayed me. She's already unconscious. 5 people have died in only 4 hours. I planned this. Endure it with guidance. Endure this with his guidance. I think everyone will die today. Once the boss shows up, everything will be solved." Finally, there was one note from outside that was in the hands of Kim Young-ja, the woman who was delivering the rice balls. She was also bringing them information. The note she had with her said, "Let's not hide this. If the boss steps forward and solves the problem, everyone will get better." She had delivered this note the morning before, but when she knocked on the ceiling, Lee Kyung-soo, the hanged man, opened the ceiling with an extremely stressed red face, like a person who had exercised beyond their limit. He was in an angry demeanor and snatched the food and note from her before closing the ceiling tile once more. There was a lot of information to learn from these notes. We will address them all, but first, the autopsy showed that the tissues did not have any poisons or chloroform-like drugs on them, and the people didn't die from poison. So what poison and water was being delivered to them? Dr. Seo had told the police that the 32 deceased, all of them, tested positive for a tranquilizer called hydramine. Hydramine, also known as diphenhydramine, is an antihistamine used for allergies or colds. Sometimes it can be given to help people fall asleep. While this drug did not attribute to their deaths, it could have been taken as a way to fall asleep prior to being strangled, as a way to minimize the emotional and physical suffering. This is consistent with the fact that 31 of the deceased were missing injuries consistent with resisting dying or fighting for your life. Even if you wish to die, your body still convulses against your will when you're hanging or being suffocated. Each of the bodies had ligature marks from the rope being used to strangle them. This is from the pressure of the rope pulling on the neck. The rope was tied in the back with a loop and pulled tight. This created a circle indentation around their neck. However, only one person had signs of resisting, and it wasn't Lee Kyung-soo. Park Sun-ja, who was the first to die, had marks all over her neck that showed that she had resisted dying. The rope left small cuts around her neck and striations up and down, as if the rope was moving as the person strangled her. She was also the only deceased person to have blunt force trauma. Dr. Seo's professional opinion was that Park Sun-ja fought for her life as she died. During her autopsy, they discovered hemorrhaging under her scalp consistent with blunt force trauma with a heavy object. The impact was just above her right ear and it left an indentation. They believe that she was struck with something hard, like a hammer, but no such object was found in the attic. Dr. Seo and Detective Kim Hyun questioned how Park Sun-ja could have been attacked like this with her children in the room with her. If she died first, why did nobody try to save her if it was murder? Was this a form of time for reflection prior to their mass suicide? Or was she being punished specifically before they were all murdered? Regardless, they agreed that Park Sun-ja did not appear to want to die and was murdered. But could she have died first, and therefore not had as much time for the tranquilizers to take effect, and in resisting, hit her head on something? Without the forensics team having more time with the bodies, we may never know. But that wasn't the only interesting piece of evidence collected from the autopsies. Dr. Seo, as part of any criminal autopsies, tested all of their orifices of the deceased for any irregular substances like poison, toxins, alcohol, etc. He discovered that 12 of the dead women's vaginal swabs came back positive for semen. This would have been present in the last 2 days. He raised the concern that these women might have been sexually assaulted during or after their deaths, but this was not included in the final police report. The semen could have been there from consensual sex, but it was unlikely considering the conditions these women and men were in and that 4 of the people in the attic were related. Park Sun-ja and her 2 sons and daughters were there together. Her children were all adults, but with the rest of the details of the case, Dr. Seo considered it unlikely that this was consensual sex. Semen DNA testing was relatively new and was only used when necessary. In this instance, it was not considered necessary for further testing, so it didn't happen. Without the preservation of those samples, they couldn't do any further testing when the case was reopened. Dr. Seo and Detective Kim Hyun, in their interviews with the production crew for the documentary episode In the Name of God, spoke a lot about their doubts about Lee Kyung-soo being the muscle that killed all 31 people and then took his own life. Lee Kyung-soo's ligature marks were not consistent with the person who hanged themselves. The rope marks on his neck were identical to that of the other 30 people, excluding Park Sun-ja, who showed signs of resistance. His ligature marks fully wrapped around his neck and were consistent in pressure. Picture a person, if you will, hanging by the neck from a noose. Not a pleasant picture, but imagine what the weight of a person does to the shape of the rope. As you pull down on the rope, it secures under the jaw and goes up behind your ears. The rope narrows as it enters the knot. The rope would lift up off of the skin of the neck and create a triangle shape from behind. This was not consistent with the ligature marks that were on the back of his neck. The noose was not touching the back of his neck. He was strangled to death in the exact same manner that the others were prior to being propped up on the noose. To further support this, his knees were also bent, his feet were dragging on the ground. His body would have resisted the hanging and forced him to stand up or kick off the ground in any manner. There were no signs of resistance against the rope from even swinging or shaking or hitting his feet on the ground. So if he was killed and placed on the rope to appear like he killed himself, who was the 33rd person? Kim Young-ja, the woman who brought the food, was not strong enough to lift a man of his size onto a rope. But perhaps more people knew about the mass suicide than were telling the police. In Kim Hyun's professional opinion, it would have taken at least 6 people 10 hours to have strangled and killed 32 people, placed them in piles, and put the man in a noose. Lee Kyung-soo could not have done this alone. Dr. Seo confirmed that the time span of the deaths was over 10 hours. Park Sun-ja died 10 hours before the final victim, Lee Kyung-soo. In Lee Kyung-soo's autopsy, his odd ligature marks were not the only piece of evidence pointing towards there being another person that partook in their suicides or murders. When strangling a person, holding the rough, thick rope will create bruising on the hands. Pulling on the rope to strangle someone from behind takes considerable amount of strength. And if the person resists against the rope or pulls against you, the rope will leave friction burns and striations on the hands. That's from strangling one person. Lee Kyung-soo was said to have strangled all 31 other people, including Park Sun-ja, who fought for her life. Having done this, he would have significant bruising and burns on his hands even if he was to have worn gloves, which nothing of the sort was found at the scene. There were no marks at all on his hands, or any of the other deceased's hands. Something was not adding up. There must have been another person or multiple people who partook in the killings. However, the fingerprints and footprints on the wall that they used to climb up only belonged to the 31 people who died, so whoever killed them might have done it elsewhere. Dr. Seo believed that the 32 people were killed in the restaurant area after coming down from the ceiling. They no doubt had been alive at one point in the ceiling, but that didn't negate the fact that it would be near impossible to have killed 32 people in the tiny space of the attic. The ceiling space was barely enough for the 32 people to sit side by side, let alone be strangled one by one while being tied up. That is why the bodies were placed in piles on top of the plywood boards, because they wouldn't have fit otherwise, and if they were placed on the ceiling tiles, they would have just fallen through. Dr. Seo proposed that they had been killed outside of the ceiling and then put back. But remember about the 8 officers that were needed just to move one of the bodies at a time? It would be even more difficult to move them up. Dr. Seo and Kim Hyun believed that this was supported by the fact that their hands and feet were bound very loosely. If you're resisting against those ties, they would have come undone. You might also have some bruising or marks from pulling against the bindings. It might be that they weren't tied up to prevent them from resisting, but to make it so their arms and legs didn't hang down as they moved the bodies. In the 10 hours that the victims died, a singular Five Oceans white van was seen coming and going from the factory in the late hours of the night. This van was not tested for DNA evidence, but the killer or killers could have loaded the large vans with the bodies and brought them into the building over 2 trips. This theory does not fit with the evidence that Park Sun-ja and the other 31 people had been living in the attic for some time because of the use of the bathroom and the food rationing. However, someone was coming and going from the factory that may have known what was happening. People were still living at the Yongin factory during this time who had no idea that Park Sun-ja and the others were in the attic. One employee who cooperated with the police stated that the day before the 32 people died, they heard noises coming from the cafeteria area of the dormitories. They heard what sounded like crying and grunting. It sounded like a time of reflection meeting, so they steered clear of the area lest they be brought into it. They had no idea that they were hearing the beginning of the deaths of 32 people. Let's go back to the other 3 notes that were found. I'll reread them. The notes read, first, Samu is suffering too. The reconstructed note read, the development expenses will increase. Keep quiet. Keep your mouth shut. They betrayed me. She's already unconscious. 5 people have died in 4 hours. I planned this out. Endure this with his guidance. I think everyone will die today. Once the boss shows up, everything will be solved. Then, the note that Kim Young-ja delivered seemingly in the middle of the deaths read, let's not hide this. If the boss steps forward and solves the problem, everyone will get better. The people in the attic with Park Sun-ja were not just her children and the people who were most devoted to her. They were the people in Five Oceans who had brought in the most money from private loans. They were the people whose names were on the paperwork for promissory notes and fraudulent loans. These are the people who would also serve prison time if they were all caught by the police. The torn-up note was clearly written in the midst of their deaths. 5 people had died in the span of 4 hours. That means in the next 6 hours, the rest of the 27 people would also die. That time frame seems constricting to the speed at which people died. But who was this boss that they were referring to if not Park Sun-ja? And what was Samu? In the Five Oceans offices, there was a lot of paperwork with the company Samu Trading on it. They had finances tied to them, trading, exportation, and sales. Samu Trading Company was owned by Yoo Byung-an, the CEO of another company called Semo. This is getting complicated, but don't worry. Yoo Byung-an's real title is a leader of a religious cult called Salvation Sect. Yoo Byung-an acquired the bankrupt textile company Samu in 1978. The company's purpose was an export shipping company, shipping as designated through his second corporation, Semo, which he used to manufacture electronics, sell real estate, and manage ships and ferries. Five Oceans, since its beginning, had a money trail that led to Samu Trading Company. It appeared that these 2 companies were running the exact same Ponzi scheme, but Park Sun-ja was lower on the family pyramid. Just like her, his employees saw him as their god. Salvation Sect was easily hundreds of times more populated than Five Oceans, and Park Sun-ja was one of his followers. Yoo Byung-an appointed pastors in his church to go start sham businesses and churches in high-population cities to get more loans for their Ponzi scheme, loans they would never pay back. Park Sun-ja was assigned to the city of Daejeon. She was considered a successful location for a very long time. Park Sun-ja had joined Salvation Sect after graduating from seminary college, where she was introduced to a Jehovah's Witness church. From there, she met members of the Salvation Sect, which practiced what is considered a heretical version of Gospel Baptist denomination. Sun-ja joined the Protestant Evangelical Baptist Church of the Salvation Sect. There were 2 churches under the Salvation Sect. The Protestant Korean Baptist Association has said that the Salvation Sect is a disgrace to the church. The Salvation Sect has many beliefs that differ from the rest of their denomination, but we won't go into details about all of them. Mostly they're unrelated to this case. However, a belief that Park Sun-ja took with her as a religious leader was that forgiveness of sin is too easily obtained in traditional Christianity. For many churches, ask and you shall be forgiven is the standard. However, they believed that if you ask to be forgiven and then you sin again, you will not be allowed into heaven if you don't repent. Park Sun-ja's way of repenting was the time of reflection beatings. When she went to Daejeon to open Odaeyang or Five Oceans, she took with her a few of the Salvation Sect followers. She had also already met her husband, who is also a part of the church. She planted herself in Daejeon and began to collect loans for the Salvation Sect. This money trail proved that Five Oceans was a front to collect money for Yu Byung-an and the Salvation Sect. Park Seung-ja would collect money from the loans and send it to an assistant of Yu Byung-an. That way, his name wouldn't be tied to any of the money. Because she was sending all of this money up the ladder, she had to continually take out more loans to pay off the interest for her creditors. Yu Byung-an would eventually be tried in court for his ties to fraud, but because his name was nowhere on any of the paperwork, his assistant would take the blunt of the fall. He reported that the money came into his business as something he referred to as a development expense. This term was used in the ripped-up note. It said, "The development expenses will increase." This was a very specific term to Yu Byung-an because he referred to people who were completely devoted and dependent on his cult as developed people. So the money from them was development expenses. The note, "Samu is suffering too," was delivered by Park Seung-ja's younger sister in the second day of their hiding. Her younger sister had visited Samu Trading to explain the situation at Five Oceans. Because they were a branch off of a branch from Salvation Sect, they needed to cut their ties with Samu, but they needed help. Park Seung-ja had asked for help in solving their problem and preventing it from getting worse. But then this note comes back and reads, "Samu is suffering too." This meant that they couldn't help pay off all of the loans that would probably get rid of the fraud charges. The parent companies couldn't do anything for them. But Park Seung-ja was devout to Yu Byung-an and knew what she needed to do. To protect their leader, they all needed their secrets to die with them, whether that was by their suicide or that Yu Byung-an sent someone to kill them and staged the scene to look like a suicide. There's no evidence that Yu Byung-an was tied to the deaths of the 32 people, but in 1992, he was arrested and convicted of habitual fraud under the mask of religion. He served 4 years in prison and was released. What happened to him next? Well, he used that money to become a chaebol, a family that holds incredible wealth, power, and monopoly in South Korea. His family controls a large industrial conglomerate and dozens of businesses. On top of this, he owned the company Ahe that markets Yu Byung-an's art. He started to dabble in photography and was offered an exhibit in Vanderbilt Hall, then the National Gallery in Prague, Lancaster House, and even the Louvre. If you go to Louvre, you can see etched in stone a wall of patrons, and on there it reads, Ahe. His fraud and cult didn't end when he became part of the elite. Semo was still manufacturing and managing ferries across Korea. In particular, he was the de facto owner of the Sewol Ferry. If you haven't listened to my Sewol Ferry episode, I highly recommend it because it's riveting and troubling how deep the crimes tied to chaebol families and politicians go. If you haven't heard about the Sewol Ferry incident, which I purposefully do not refer to as an accident, it was an avoidable tragedy in which 304 people died when a ferry sank due to negligence from multiple parties. The Sewol Ferry was partially owned by Cheonghae-jin Marine, which Yu Byung-an's family owns. Following this event in 2014, Yu Byung-an knew that he would serve time again and he went into hiding. A reward for his whereabouts that led to his arrest was set at 50 million won. Just a few months later, it was increased tenfold to 500 million won, or about $500,000 US. But the next month, as the pressure to arrest him grew, his body was found, with advanced decomposition in a plum field about 200 miles south of Seoul. He was wearing his nicest clothing and was surrounded by a book he'd written, several empty alcohol bottles, and some shark liver oil tonic from his own company. The cause of death could not be determined because of the state of his decomposition. Returning to the year before Yu Byung-an was arrested in 1991, a new piece of evidence presented itself in the case. Chairman Kim Hyun and Chief of Forensics Dr. Seo did not think that they or the team would find any new evidence in the case. There was very little hope for solving this case, until 6 men walked into a police station and said, "We killed No Sun-ho." No Sun-ho was one of the men that they were still trying to find, whose name was on a lot of the paperwork. This was No Sun-ho, who was the Five Oceans general manager. Since they were looking for someone who could have assisted in killing the 32 people, they assumed that No Sun-ho could have been involved because he was a higher up in the company who had a lot to lose from the fraud coming to light. He was responsible for managing their books and keeping track of their loans and repayments. He was a bookkeeper. The police visited No Sun-ho's mother and put her on TV, forcing her to make a statement about her son's wrongdoings. She cried and begged for her son to come home and confess to his crimes. She wanted him to reveal what had truly happened. But then, 6 men who were former Five Oceans members confessed to murdering and burying No Sun-ho a few years later, for no discernible reason. They most likely wouldn't have gotten caught if they didn't turn themselves in. The 6 men said that they were also victims in this case. They were Five Oceans employees, and during a time of reflection, they were made to beat No Sun-ho because he confessed to the group that the company was going to collapse and that their doom was impending. He told them that he was going to leave the company and had made plans to hand over his work to someone else. Park Sun-ja couldn't handle the embarrassment in front of her followers. This insubordination led her to force the men to beat No Sun-ho until he died. Park Sun-ja had her followers beat each other at least monthly, and that other deaths had occurred. No Sun-ho's body was found where the men led the police. The men led the police to where No Sun-ho's body was. His body was buried in a sack. The 2 other victims were Hwang Suk-ja, the dormitory housekeeper, and Jo Jae-sun, the child care center's nanny. They were all murdered and buried secretly after dying in a time of reflection. The men were willing to cooperate with the police and told them everything that happened. They were coached by a police officer who was a part of the Salvation sect in Five Oceans, which we know now is one and the same. Although Park Sun-ja's followers didn't all know this, the police officer had coached them that they should state that they were a part of Salvation sect and cut off all ties to Five Ocean if ever questioned, so that it couldn't be tied back to them. Since Five Oceans was under the police's eye, former followers should be absorbed into the Salvation sect. The case was investigated a total number of 3 times, in 1987, 1988, and 1991 under 2 different presidents. Under President Chun Doo-hwan, there was a portion of the case they could not investigate. President Chun Doo-hwan had ties to Samu Trading Company and had even endorsed and visited the company before. He may also have had ties to Salvation sect, although this couldn't have been investigated under his ruling because he was a military dictator until 1988 when he was replaced by President Roh Tae-woo, who is a military-backed leader for democracy. People wonder if this is why Park Sun-ja received a presidential award for her philanthropic acts, when in reality, her business had done nothing to help anyone. If President Chun Doo-hwan had ties to the church, then he may have been rewarding the fraudulent businesses to help them be successful. It's also suspicious about the case that documents relating to the case were retroactively changed and altered to reflect that Park Sun-ja and her followers died on the 27th and not on the 29th, despite that Dr. Seo stated that they had died earlier that day. Their bodies were rushed to be cremated just 2 days after they were taken from the factory, not allowing Dr. Seo or his team to thoroughly conduct the autopsies and collect all of the evidence that they needed. But there was no real evidence in this case that led to a concrete conclusion. In that sense, they consider this a cold case, although technically it's solved. What do you think happened to Park Sun-ja and her 31 followers? Thank you for listening to Korean True Crime. I hope you enjoyed today's episode topic. If you'd like to vote on future episode topics, join Korean True Crime on Patreon today. If you'd like to hear more, follow the show wherever you listen and be sure to leave a review. 다음에 또 봐요. See you next time.